Today we're going to be looking at the political economy of military rule in Pakistan. I think this is perhaps arguably one of the most significant and important questions with respect to political economy. Because Pakistan is quite unique even in the region in South Asia, or if you compare it to India, insofar as the dominance of the military is concerned. Not only have we had very, very long spells of military rule in the country, but even when we've had democracy in the country, that has all pretty much been managed by the military in one way or another. Sometimes informally, but even formally through the examples, through institutions such as the National Security Council and so on. So rather than this being a lecture about sort of condemning the military or condemning Pakistanis or Pakistan as a country for constantly having military rule, etc., which would be a sort of moralistic lesson. What we really want to try and understand is what are the reasons for recurring military rule or military intervention in the context of politics. Now, one can provide many, many different explanations. There's an explanation that is provided by the military itself, or rather arguably perhaps not by the military, but by military rulers themselves, people who have been in power, that the reason why they've had to intervene has to do with the incompetence, corruption or incompetence of civilian rulers themselves. So I think we're quite familiar with that argument as it is, because that is very much part of the mainstream narrative. Wherever military rulers have taken over, that has become the narrative of the state and government of that particular period. So I'm not going to focus on that narrative, but rather I'm going to look at an argument presented by Ayesha Siddiqua. So you can say that as far as political economy is concerned, the person that's made the most cogent argument about what are the economic imperatives behind the military constantly taking over power in Pakistan, Ayesha Siddiqua's name would be in the front of the list of such scholars that have done such serious work. Her book is called Military Incorporated, Military Inc. for short, and it is the only work of its kind which actually tries to gather together data about what the economic role of the military actually is. Detailed data on for example, on the Army Welfare Trust, on the FWO, and so on and so forth, and other institutes, etc. As she tries to put together a picture with data about what the economic stakes of the military are in Pakistan. And I think that's very important and very precious, precisely for that reason, that nobody's done any work which approaches this question in the kind of detail as she has approached it. So she gives this a particular name, which is also present in other literature and political science, which is MILBUS. What does MILBUS stand for? It's military business, short for military business. What is that? It is that the economic and business interests of Pakistan military are the main cause of the involvement of the military in the politics of Pakistan. Relatively speaking, quite simple theory, not very complicated to understand, that the military as an institution may intervene in the politics or the economy of Pakistan to protect its own interests. But obviously that has to be substantiated with facts, with data, with evidence, and so on. So she defines MILBUS as military capital used for the personal benefit of the military fraternity, especially the officer cadre, which is neither a part of nor recorded as part of the defense budget. So it's very important to understand this, that there is the defense budget that's about a quarter, 22% of the overall government budget. Some part of the military budget, which is paid in pensions and other perks, etc., has been shifted over to the civilian budget. So if you add that, you would add a couple of percentage points. But that is something quite distinct and separate. Every country in the world takes out a bit of money to give to the military, otherwise obviously the military cannot survive. And while we can argue that it's too much or too little, that is part of the defense budget of that particular country. What Ayesha Siddiqua is talking about here is not the defense budget of the country. What she's talking about in the context of MILBUS is everything else that the military is doing which is part of the political economy of the military industrial complex of Pakistan. So let's have a quick interesting look, because we've grown up with the military being involved at so many different levels in Pakistan that we may actually be surprised that it could be any different way. But here's just a very good and recent example of China. In 1998, China basically said that the military is too involved in the economy of the country. The military became very involved in the economy of the country of China after the Deng Xiaoping reforms. The military was somewhat squeezed for a budget in China after the Deng Xiaoping reforms, and so they began to also participate in public-private partnerships, and they developed their industrial enterprises and joint operations, etc. But the Chinese in 98 began to realize that this was having a very bad impact on the military's fighting capacity, because it was, they felt, corrupting the military. So in 1998, they took the decision that the military would begin to disinvest itself from economic enterprises. 20,000 companies were, the military basically took itself out of those companies. In Beijing alone, $170 million worth of their investments they disinvested from. And even more recently, Xi Jinping basically said that we have to halt all commercial activity of the military, kindergarten education, publishing services, real estate, rental, whatever the military is involved in, it has to completely come to an end. And over 100,000 paid service programs were ended in China after this particular thing. So China's military budget, though, the official defense budget, actually has escalated, while simultaneously it has gone out of business. So they actually have more money than before, while at the same time pulling themselves out of the economy. This is a very, very major reform in China. And the reason behind this, of course, has to do with what's called the Pivot to Asia strategy. The Pivot to Asia strategy was launched in 2012. What is the Pivot to Asia? It is basically an American strategy whereby Southeast Asian countries and East Asian countries, the Americans are sort of working diplomatically with them to isolate and contain China. And so 2012, they had the Pivot to Asia strategy. 2013, what did the Chinese launch? The One Belt, One Road initiative. In other words, they said, oh, you're pivoting around us from the Pacific Ocean, right then, we're going to go the land route, rebuild the Silk Route. It's very much the whole One Belt, One Road initiative, one part of which is the CPEC, is very much a part of their understanding of how to alter this geopolitics of power. So anyway, one of the things that they said was, if there's going to be war in the future, although they're not talking about war, but you can see that the conflict between the US and China has been escalating for quite some time. So they are saying the PLA needs to be in tip-top fighting shape to defend China. And to be in tip-top fighting shape, to be really a world-class military, they're saying, you've got to get out of the economy. You've got to do what your job is. And your job is to learn how to fight, to defend the country. Your job is not to run kindergartens, publishing services, real estate, shati ghars, etc., etc. That's not your job. So it can happen if there's a political will behind it. The military-industrial complex can disinvest from the economy. We've seen it happen. What about Pakistan? So in Pakistan, one of the key traits is that we can see from the 1950s onwards that there were many, many different political forces within Pakistan that were asserting their rights. So there were, of course, Muslim League fractured very quickly after independence, and there were many, many regional interests that arose in Pakistan in the 1950s already that were saying, give us more power, give them less power, negotiating for more or less power. One of the key, of course, questions was, what is the relationship going to be with East Pakistan? In 1955, the government imposed the one-unit scheme in which they broke up the provinces of West Pakistan with the clear purpose of balancing the population of both East versus West Pakistan, and claiming that West Pakistan ought to have parity or equal representation with East Pakistan. So, and the justification behind that and other similar steps that were taken were given in the name of national security. So you can see that for a very long time, Pakistan has tried to build a national consensus, some unity, a sense of Pakistani nationhood, a sense of coming together out of the central argument of national security. That's why often people have referred to Pakistan as a security state, some have referred to it as an insecurity state, etc. Right? The US also at the time traded democracy for security with respect to Pakistan, not because they were so much concerned about democracy or military dictatorship in Pakistan, but because they first went to India, they tried to convince India to join their anti-communist bloc, and India said, no, we're going to remain non-aligned, we'll deal with you, we'll also talk to the Soviet Union, we'll talk to both sides, and we'll see whoever offers us the better deal, we'll go with them, etc. So, having been rebuffed by Nehru, the Americans basically came to Pakistan and said, well, how about you? Would you guys like to join the Cold War pacts? And Pakistan said, absolutely. So when that began to happen, this was the 1950s, where in America itself, in the early 1950s, there was a wave of anti-communism called McCarthyism. And then there was the FBI, etc., being run by people like John Foster Dulles and so on. So there was an understanding, even in the American military establishment, that if these third world countries were experiencing left-wing or national liberation struggles, that the United States would support military dictatorships in those countries in order to reverse the possibility that these countries would move towards socialism. So that's what they did in nearly the whole of Latin America. They supported military dictatorships. This is now not a conspiracy theory, it's quite well established. And also in East Asia, countries like Taiwan and South Korea and Singapore and so on, these were all dictatorships. These are called the Asian tigers, right? These were all dictatorships, and also the countries that they partially managed to occupy, like South Korea or South Vietnam, etc., when they broke the country into two parts and they occupied the southern parts of the country, etc. So these were pretty much dictatorships that they had in these areas. So similarly in Pakistan, they gave enormous amounts of military assistance to Ayub Khan and to also nearly all the dictators, mainly because they had some geostrategic interest in that context. So, the American government throughout the 20th century has behaved in such a way that although ostensibly they support democracy and they support secularism, but where their economic interests are concerned, especially in relation to the Cold War or to socialism, they've always preferred to safeguard their economic interests over and above their ideology. That has always come first, as opposed to democracy and secularism. That's why they've had a very, very firm alliance with Saudi Arabia, which is anything but secular or democratic, which Americans are. I mean, America itself is that, right? But they've had allies that are the exact opposite of all the values that the Americans stand for. But the common thread always has been economic interests. Similarly, there have been many secular and democratic leaders elected to power and so on and so forth, professing democracy, professing secularism, whatever, openness, etc., etc. But where economic interests collided, conflicted, the Americans then did not oppose those regimes, those presidents, and so on and so forth. So what is consistent in their foreign policy is first and foremost prioritizing, the defense of their economic and geostrategic interests. So in much the same way, in the context of Pakistan, not out of any malice, but out of the prerogative of fighting the Soviet Union and communism, they supported military dictatorship in Pakistan in that period. And even they supported Ayub, they supported Ziaul Haq against, of course, Afghan communism in Afghanistan, and they also supported Musharraf, which is kind of funny because Musharraf they were supporting to fight the thing that they themselves created in the previous period when they were supporting Zia. It would be funny if it weren't also simultaneously very tragic, but that's the reality. So Milbas was justified initially as welfare of the personnel who were taking care of Pakistan. In the Musharraf period, this enormously escalated. Generals, retired generals, etc., major generals, very high-ranking people were very much part of the government. They were running public enterprises. They were very much also part of the private sector. They were, they have enjoyed many positions, decision-making positions at the top of society. So out of over 1,000 military officers who were inducted into civilian posts, at least over 100 of them were very high-ranking generals and retired generals and so on. Khalid Ahmed, prolific writer, of course, editor and so on, says that we should pay the price for what we believe in. There is a paradox triggered by our nationalism, which allows the military to monopolize the state's resources. So since our nationalism is very much centered around the idea of national security, which itself is centered around the idea that India is a major threat, that somehow or the other Pakistanis don't believe in Pakistan and that they're going to go over to India, as did happen in many parts of Pakistan. It did this. That's also true. But the insecurity about that is so great that the security regime has been used to create this national consensus. So what is the problem with that? Well, the first and major problem, of course, is military professionalism. The impact that the involvement of the military in the economy has on the professionalism of the military. So, so not only does the state become captured by the sense of insecurity and this become a sort of state of martial rule, but it erodes slowly and over time the ability of the military to do its job, which is to fight wars, because it sets up a conflict of interest between their economic interests and their role, their constitutional and main role, which is the defense of the country. Ayesha Jalal even says that the military, in the context of Pakistan, has become a class in and for itself. A class in the same way like you have a capitalist class, or you have a landed class, or you have other classes in society. They've become a class of people themselves. So it's not just a profession anymore, it's an economic role now. And in that sense, it's taken on the form of a class. Militaries echelons into powerful have turned into powerful groups of capitalists. Serving and retired members have been transformed from a fraternity into an independent class. And so this class has to defend its interests. For a long time, Article 58(2)(b) served as a firebreak to disciplined errant regimes. So you know what this article is? It is the 8th Amendment, part of the 8th Amendment, by which the president of the country can dismiss the elected representatives of the people. And it was used many times to dismiss both the governments of Benazir Bhutto as well as the governments of Nawaz Sharif, the elected governments, etc. But even more importantly, now this no longer is applicable to Pakistan, but even more importantly is the National Security Council. Initially, it was created in 1969 under Yahya Khan, but then it was disbanded almost immediately. And it was revived under Musharraf in 2004. Then again, it was dismissed by the PPP in 2008 and revived again, ironically, by the PMLN in 2013. And of course, it exists today. What is the National Security Council? It is a body where the top civilians and the top military people basically sit together to discuss foreign policy, domestic policy, any given policy. The ostensible reason for that, of course, is any threat to security is discussed between the military and the civilian leadership. But the National Security Council does a lot more than discuss only external threats, because it also construes many internal issues essentially as external threats. So if there's a problem, let's say, with the people of the frontier, tribal agency, that is construed as a security threat and therefore comes under the National Security Council. If the peasants of Okada rise up, that is construed as a national security threat, it comes under the National Security Council. If there is an Aurat March that is considered hybrid fifth generational warfare, it can come under the NSC purview. Anything can be brought under the NSC purview if you accuse it of being funded by foreign agents or being part of some fifth generational hybrid war.
I just composition of that?
Yes, so here is the composition currently. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Committee, chiefs of the Pakistan Army, Air Force, Navy are all members of the National Security Council. In addition to that, the Defense Minister Pervez Khattak, Interior Minister Ijaz Shah, Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi, Abdul Hafiz Sheikh, Advisor on Economic Affairs, to PM Information and Broadcasting, Firdos Ashik Awan, one of my favorites, and Special Assistant to PM on National Security Division, Moeed Yusuf, is taken a step up from LUMS, as you can see. They are all part of the National Security Council. So, that's the composition. The Milbus is a double-edged sword because it increases competition also within the military for economic resources. So Milbus, Ayesha Siddiqua tells us, controls maybe 23% of the assets of the corporate sector, mainly with two very big foundations, that's the Fauji Foundation and the Army Welfare Trust. These are the big businesses, military businesses of Pakistan. And it's not one, it's sort of, the Fauji Foundation is a network of different businesses, etc. Similarly, with the Army Welfare Trust that handles a whole network, an array of very many different kinds of businesses. Ikram Sehgal tells us that the jump from Major General is a major financial jump, and so a brigadier who has a good chance for promotion does not want to disturb the future and will generally support their superiors, not only out of a sense of military discipline, which itself is quite strong, but even more out of a sense of but also furthermore out of a sense of what they could possibly gain in the near future as a result of their promotion. So this sets up a conflict of interests, and we've heard this phrase spoken quite often, that officers become property dealers, they turn into millionaires overnight, and scandals have hit this section of the armed forces which threaten to demoralize the morale, discipline, and unity of the army. There are two very big, one can give certain examples, but there are two very big cases that had a very huge impact on the public perception of the military's involvement in the economy. The first one is concerning Lieutenant General Zahid Ali Akbar, retired. He became Chairman WAPDA. He was Chairman WAPDA from 1987 to 1992. And when he was investigated under the government of Nawaz Sharif, he was, by the National Accountability Bureau, he was found to have 77 bank accounts and with loads and loads of money in them. He accepted his guilt. He said, yes, I am guilty. And he made a plea bargain with the government. He returned 200 million rupees to the National Accountability Bureau. And he said, don't put me in jail, etc. I'll live out the rest of my days in Pakistan, which he did. So he wasn't sent to prison. He gave some money back, and then things were fine. But the even bigger case was with Admiral Mansoor al-Haq, who was the chief of the Navy. So the Augusta submarine case with the French, etc., was the big scandal in 1997. He was convicted of that. He was imprisoned for that. He also negotiated a plea bargain in 2003 and to 5, and where he returned $7.5 million. This was the equivalent of 2 years of the salary for the entire Navy. That was an enormous sum of money. And later, he paid an additional $2.5 million. He was released, and then he made a case in 2013. He went into the Sindh High Court, and he said, look, I've served in 2 wars. He was, by that time, very old, I think 90, 91 years old. And he said, I've fought in 2 major wars in Pakistan. I was a POW. I've served my country. I have given back the money, etc. Now, please restore my rank. It's very important. It's not like he's going to get anything out of it. But the rank was restored, whereas privileges and perks were not restored. He lived out the rest of his days in Pakistan. Ali Chima refers to not these things specifically, but to all of this as a form of inefficient corruption. He says there was corruption even before, but it was at such a low level that it did not damage the overall efficiency and functioning of the economy. Now the corruption is reaching such a high level, he's saying, that it is not just facilitating or lubricating the machine or the economy, it is actually distorting resource allocation in a very, very significant way, and therefore damaging the economy quite significantly. That's why he calls it inefficient corruption. This term has become quite frequent in the last 10 years. It's quite frequently used in the last 10 years in the context of Pakistan. Praetorian democracy. Praetors, of course, were the military, folks in ancient Rome, so soldiers, etc. So Praetorian democracy means a democracy in which soldiers are also involved. And that's what we pretty much have. A cycle in which the military comes, and then you have elected governments, and then the military comes back, and then you have elected governments, and so on. Ayesha Siddiqua refers to this as a predatory cycle. In what sense is it predatory? Not in the sense that, this is a predator killing other people, but in the sense that the military business is predating over the civilian sector, pulling resources out of the civilian sector. So in economic terms, it's predatory. So in the initial years, she says, and also Zaidi and others say, the military stakes were limited only to the defense budget. But with the passage of time, it became much more involved. Public sector cooperations, contracts with various military companies, building of roads, dams, bridges, barrages, everything, and also selecting trusted people to serve on various boards. I don't know if you know this or not, but if you ever go to do, when you go for a job, you'll discover that so many factories and schools and enterprises across Pakistan have at least one member in the admin services that is a colonel or somebody from the military. And if you ask people, well, why do you have colonels in the administration of schools, colleges, universities, or they have brigadiers or whatever, why do you have them? The explanation often is that they're very efficient, they can maintain discipline, they can also, because they were part of the military, if there's any issue with respect to the state, the military or security service, they can be a good liaison between the private business and the military, so they can get, they can call up their folks and get things done, etc., etc. But the converse side of this, of course, is that it is it involves the military very, very deeply in civilian life, forwards and backwards. And on the one hand, while it may lead to the weakening of the military's own ethos of discipline, on the other hand, it may also lead to the weakening of civilian institutions themselves, which are, in any case, in the context of Pakistan, quite weak. The argument being made here is that civilian institutions, therefore, are not weak on their own account because civilians are stupid or unable to come to an agreement, but because of the imbalance between the civilian and military institutes. One institute is so powerful that it is deliberately weakening other institutes rather than those institutes being weak in and of their own accord. So what this means is it's becoming very difficult for the military to withdraw completely from the economy of Pakistan, because the military itself would have to pay a very large cost if it were to withdraw. If it were to do what the Chinese are doing. Now the Chinese military is only able to do that, i.e. get rid of its money, capital, in its investments, because the government of China is saying, whatever losses you get from that side, we're going to make up from this side. And China's military spending has been going up, keeping pace with American military spending. American military spending has gone up by 6% this last year. Chinese military spending has also gone up by 6%. They're keeping pace with American military spending. So they're saying, you don't need those businesses. We'll give you the money to do all of these things. Get out of there. So a similar process is obviously impossible for Pakistan, because Pakistan's government is broke. So if you tell them to give up Army Welfare Trust and all the businesses of Fauji Foundation, well, then you can't compensate them for those businesses. So what happens as a result is that there's a very powerful incentive for the military to stay involved. So for this purpose, then, a narrative is constructed. Are we ready for democracy? Is the Muslim world ready for democracy? Do we have competent civilian leadership? Najam Sethi says, the military bends the rules and makes their own rules so that one cannot call their actions, corrupt, or call it corruption. Only 3 slides left. I can see that some of you are tiring out already. Today's lecture is going to be uncharacteristically short. I'll do my 3 more slides, then we'll have a nice break, and then we'll have a discussion, etc. So cheer up, wake up, it's okay. Ghabrana nahi. All right. So to continue, so civil-military relations result in, so Milbus results, first of all, in deepening the chasm between the center and the periphery. Most often we have seen that in the periphery, the military is the only real authority that is undertaking any decision making. For example, in Balochistan, in tribal areas, and so on and so forth, it's essentially the military that takes the decisions, and civilian power is incredibly weak. And this sets up a dynamic whereby the Baloch or tribal Pashtuns may say that we have no representation. We have no say in our lives. We can't take any decisions on our own behalf. Now, Musharraf's government was actually quite successful in the initial years in wooing or romancing civil society. I remember I had just started teaching as a young professor here at the Lahore University of Management Sciences, having just finished my master's degree. Good God, it seems like that was ages ago. Actually, it was decades ago. Musharraf had just taken over. And a lot of your civil society folks, NGOs and so on and so forth, what you call your liberal, intelligentsia, was actually very much deeply in favor of Musharraf. And I recall being very much considered a dogmatic, far crazy leftist at the time, because I was never in favor of military dictatorship and opposed Musharraf from the very beginning. But my real intention was to tell you how much civil society at the time actually was fond of General Pervez Musharraf. Musharraf came with this famous picture where he was holding two dogs, and everybody just fell in love with the fact that he was holding two dogs. And nobody wanted to discuss his economic policy anymore or anything else. It's like, oh my God, that's so sweet, etc. It was quite crazy. But there was another reason behind that as well, which was that in the late 1990s, Nawaz Sharif was introducing the Sharia Bill. And the Sharia Bill was strongly opposed by the liberal intelligentsia of Pakistan. And so when Musharraf came to power, he said, well, I'm not going to do any of that Sharia Bill sort of stuff. I'm in favor of enlightened moderation. And everybody's like, yes, this is a good military dictator. And of course, that didn't go as they thought it would, or as it was planned. And interestingly, Nawaz then learned from that mistake, and when he came back after many years of exile and after the lawyers' movement began, he realized, no, one mistake that I made in my politics was the Sharia Bill, because I lost the support of the liberal intelligentsia, which is of course part of the Pakistani elite. And to gain that back, he never went back to that kind of politics or those kinds of policies again. So he actually shifted from the right of the spectrum into the center of the spectrum, leaving a big vacuum in the right of the spectrum. And who shifted into the vacuum left by Nawaz Sharif moving from the right of the spectrum into the center? Imran Khan. That's right. So he occupied, so when we say that Imran Khan is today what Nawaz Sharif was in the 1990s, that's not altogether incorrect. In fact, Nawaz and Benazir were going at each other like Imran Khan versus PML and PPP are going at each other today. It's the same formation, the same arguments, the same positions, except the individuals representing them have changed, have transformed. But the positions remain largely the same. That's the interesting thing about Pakistani politics and about all politics, that an individual may shift position from the right to the left or from the left to the right, but the position itself remains largely intact so long as there is a constituency within that society for that particular position. The same thing happened, for example, to Bhutto, who was very much, Askandar Mirza and Ayub Khan's main man, their blue-eyed boy, their prodigy, etc. He was with the establishment. He was an establishment figure. And then he shifted across the spectrum towards the left and became the opposite. And when he shifted, Here's another interesting irony. When he shifted to the left, the traditional party of the left, which is the National Awami Party, that shifted to the right. So there was a change between PPP and National Awami Party, and Bhutto persecuted the PPP, and the National Awami Party, having become the ANP, then in fact was one of the key players in the PNA movement, which invited and supported Ziaul Haq. Talk about irony, right? So the party of the left, National Awami Party, went to the right. The party of the right went to the left. They fought each other. Who came out on top? Neither, Ziaul Haq, right? Then the second formation was PPP versus PMLN. They fought each other. Who won? Neither. They made a bloc. That bloc was, of course, the Charter of Democracy. As soon as that bloc was made, that's when PTI broke with Nawaz. Before that, you'll see that Imran Khan always used to praise Nawaz Sharif. It was this central thing that broke it. What is the Charter of Democracy? It was an agreement and understanding between PPP and PMLN that the experience of the 1990s had showed that they had tried to utilize the Eighth Amendment and the military establishment against each other. They had played it against each other, and they would no longer do that. And that's why when PPP won the election after the lawyers' movement was over in 2008 and Benazir was assassinated, PMLN went into docile opposition to the PPP. They accepted the results. They said, we'll make the government in Punjab, but we're not going to challenge the central government. They won the election, and we'll go with that. Now that was viewed by PTI as a sellout, because what he wanted was Noon to take on the PPP government in 2008. Of course, the PTI had no basis to take on the government, because I think they didn't even win one seat, because they boycotted the election. How could they have won any seat? But they were not going to win any seat in 2008 anyway. The electorate, in fact, rewarded the PMLN for this, for playing the role of a steady, soft opposition, because that was a very tense time when Benazir, of course, was assassinated, because in Sindh in particular, there was a wave, an enormous wave of anger and disbelief, and the slogans were resounding across Sindh, ke Pakistan na khape, and Zardari came and said, nahi, Pakistan khape, vagara, vagara. You remember that? Yeah. And had the PPP at that time said, we don't want anything to do with Pakistan, that would have caused a really, really huge problem that could not really be very easily solved, in my view. So Musharraf's main aim, of course, was to isolate politically his two main rivals. The people who could really challenge him at that time in terms of popularity or mass support, etc., were either the PPP Benazir or the PMLN with Nawaz. And they were, of course, coming closer and closer together because both of them were out in the open. The sections of the PPP that thought, well, this is a very good thing, Musharraf has overthrown Nawaz, maybe we should talk with Musharraf and we can come to power. At first, they tried to open up communication with them, but Musharraf said, yes, I'll take PPP, but without Benazir. And so sections of the PPP crossed over to Musharraf, floor crossed. That was Rao Sikandar and Aftab Sherpa, etc. They crossed over to Musharraf and to the Kaf League, and they formed what was called the PPP Patriots Group, which eventually became in the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, the Qaumi Watan Party. Since the PPP and the PMLN were the main sort of contestants for power, anybody was preferable to them. So Musharraf worked with the MQM, the PMLQ, which was called the King's Party, King with a Q at that time, King's Party, and then also the MMA to solidify a political bloc. Now this gives you a very good and interesting idea about what Praetorian democracy is. It's not pure dictatorship in the sense that you have a military dictator and civilians play no role. That's not how Pakistani military dictatorships have worked. They have worked in a military-civil partnership in which civilians have been just as ready and willing to partner with the military, including elected representatives of the people, to work with the military in this environment. So Praetorian democracy, it means that sometimes the military becomes comes into the front, and sometimes it goes into the back, but the military and civilians are always working together in some form or another to run the system. That really is how the system actually runs. So that's why we call it Praetorian democracy. It's never the case that the military is completely out of power, nor is it the case that civilians are completely out of power. There's a mixture always. And I think all the military dictators, including Ayub Khan, have recognized that Pakistan is far too large and diverse a country to govern without some involvement of civilians at some significant level. So the key thing is to pick out political formations or political leaders that would not disturb the main interests, whether economic or whether ideological in the terms of the narrative, the master narrative that is being constructed, or in terms of key policy-making ideas of the military. So these are the three things that you cannot touch. You can't touch the master narrative that the military has given, why it took power, or etc., etc. If you touch that, you're out of favor. You can't touch key policies, Kashmir, Afghanistan, etc., because if you touch those, that damages, certain interests. And you cannot touch the internal workings, the economic or otherwise workings of the military. These are the key three spots in which the military is highly sensitive. If you ask me, why did Zardari survive? How did Zardari survive? How did he finish his term? He finished his term because very early on, he, being, actually quite a good politician in the Machiavellian political sense, not necessarily in the sense of bringing about some great transformation, but understanding power, he understood these are the key things that I cannot transform. I can do a lot of other things, but I can't touch these particular things. So he made a modus vivendi with the military establishment where he would not shake the boat on these key issues, and the boat would smooth relatively safely. So wherever politicians do challenge that, sometimes advertently, sometimes inadvertently. For example, with Dawn leaks, it was never intentional for Noon League to disturb the delicate balance between the Noon League and the military. Why was it delicate? It was delicate because Noon League was one of the main people pushing the lawyers' movement. So Nawaz didn't want to disturb that narrative or that balance, but it did get disturbed. It got disturbed when Nawaz had a meeting to ask the military generals about extremism, etc., and then Dawn League sort of read that out, and that spiraled into a conflict between the government and the military. So Zaidi also, I'm just throwing him in a little bit, talks about the various political formations. He talks about, in chapter 26, one of his main contentions is that in the last period, Pakistan has seen the explosion of the middle class. We've become an urban middle class society. But let's not make the mistake of thinking, he says, that this middle class is, highly appreciative of democracy, wants a secular democratic society. Far from it, it's actually quite conservative, and actually it's not really very pro-democratic at all. And if you want an example of that, just try posting against Khalilur Rahman Qamar, and you will find out just how progressive or conservative the middle class of Pakistan is. So what's going to happen in the future? Well, obviously, military business impacts the growth of democracy and the strength of civilian institutes. The military becomes a class itself. It becomes either the elite or part of the elite, and therefore loses its ability to be an arbiter within the elite or between the elite and other people, etc. The military also, and this is one of the key things, has been very central as you sort of were hinting at or alluding to, the management of the religious right. The military has found at very key historic moments that the religious right may be very useful to them. It was not always like this, because if you remember, go back into history, Ayub Khan had no use for the religious right. Ayub Khan was a military dictator, but he was a modernist kind of military dictator. You could call him a, relatively speaking, secular kind of military dictator. That was the model. So he had no use for organizations like the Jamaat-e-Islami or all these other religious parties. But when the challenge of Bhuttoism arose, what was Bhuttoism? Left-wing populism arose, and industries were nationalized, lands were taken over, big bureaucrats were kicked out of their jobs, etc., etc. The traditional Ayub elite, in a certain sense, was challenged. The Ayub elite could not have fought on the grounds of its old narrative the developmentalist narrative of the 1960s, it couldn't have fought and convinced the public because that narrative had been defeated by the end of the 1960s. So the new narrative that was now used to defeat the left-wing populism of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was Islamization. This was the new narrative that was brought in by General Zia. And if you want to understand General Zia's Islamization, the central point of that is to defeat PPP populism. Really, make no mistake about it. He is ready to compromise on any. He's also a very shrewd politician. He's a good politician despite being a military general. He was actually, understood politics quite well. And he understood his enemy is PPP. How to isolate it? So he's very ready and willing to make concessions and compromises with political parties and other folks as long as he gets to do what he gets to do, which is isolate PPP. So Islamization's central motive is that. Now the PPP also transforms as a result of its confrontation with General Zia and his confrontation with the establishment. The transformation of PPP is very interesting in this regard because what happens, and also what's happening overall in the world, the transformation of the PPP is that they feel they isolated the elite of Pakistan with Bhutto's populism taking over, factories and taking over lands, etc. So they don't no longer want to do any of that. So PPP transforms from an economically left-wing party, which wasn't very good with respect to its secular credentials. Remember, for example, Bhutto, declared Jummah to be the national holiday and declared Ahmadis to be non-Muslims and banned drinking and etc., etc. So he went along with many Islamic provisions in that sense. But he was very left-wing, you could say, or left-wing populist in terms of his economic program. Now, the current PPP, in fact, even during Benazir's, in fact, this began in Benazir's time, has reversed itself. So economically, PPP is now very much aligned with IMF and, what we would call a right-of-center economic program. It's not even a centrist program, it's a right-of-center economic program. But now, with Bilawal, etc., and even with Zardari, they are very keen to support relatively speaking, liberal or secular causes. So they are, in a certain sense, they are repackaging themselves mainly as a liberal party, whereas in the olden days, they were packaged mainly as a left-wing party, Roti Kapda Makan Wali party. Today, they are more of a let's support Aurat March kind of party. Right? Not that there's anything wrong with supporting Aurat March, but it's a repackaging of the PPP. And this transformation really has occurred both as a consequence of the confrontation with the state, constant confrontation with the state, as well as a consequence of the changes in the international political economy. When the movement began, by 2007, it reached a peak. And when it reached a peak, the religious right, which was part of the movement, made a bid to get the narrative of the movement, to get the hegemony and leadership of the movement. To do that, they began to take over Islamabad. And that began with the Lal Masjid, in the hopes that the lawyers' movement would support them. But the opposite happened. The lawyers' movement didn't support them. Musharraf crushed that thing, that Lal Masjid takeover. And when he crushed it, a new organization was created called TTP, led by Baitullah Masood. And the difference between the TTP and the TTA, of course, was that the TTA was an Afghan organization which was pro-Pakistan military, and the TTP is a Pakistan organization which is anti-Pakistan military. In other words, they were agreeing with Zahwari, who was saying, declare war on the Pakistan military because that is a kafir military, etc. So they declared war after 2007 on the Pakistan military, the result of which was, of course, the enormous destruction, death and destruction within Pakistan. Because when Musharraf crushed the Lal Masjid, they formed the TTP and declared war. So there was now opened up in the context of Pakistan a conflict between what I call the A team and the B team. If the religious right was the B team of the military, the B team didn't want to be the B team anymore. They wanted to now call the shots and run the show, as opposed to the military calling the shots and running the show. So they made a very serious bid for power, which of course caused the entire conflict escalating throughout the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and leading up to the PTM, etc., etc. But this was the background of that entire conflict. Last slide. So to sum up, the military's main objective at the time was to utilize, and still is, that where they can utilize, much like the Americans, much like any good politician really, where they can utilize the chinks in civilian forces, whether it is a chink between religious and religious party, or between religious and secular parties, or a chink within secular parties between themselves, where they can utilize these contradictions to their benefit to defeat their main rival at the time, they are ready and willing to ally themselves and align themselves or offer patronage to any power in order to get their ends. If this happens, by the way, everywhere in politics. Abbas, you might be thinking, this only bad people do this. Good people do it, bad people do it, everybody does it, it's part of politics. Only young kids who have been taught from बचपन कि झूठ बोलना बड़ी बुरी बात है और सच बोलना चाहिए से कि ये तो बड़ी गलत चीज़ की, people who study politics recognize that this is how politics works. So do you think Spartacus was averse to dealing with pirates and horrible people if it helped him to defeat Rome? Of course not. Do you think Spartacus was averse to looting and pillaging if it helped to reinforce the supplies of his troops to fight the Roman army? Of course not. He did it. Do you think the communists were averse to taking money from the Germans, even from the Germans, whom their very country was fighting at the time, and do you think Lenin was averse to to utilizing German intelligence to get into Russia in order to spark the revolution, which would then fight Germany in turn? Of course not. All of this is part of politics and much else, which is fun and interesting to look at. So everybody does it. Do you think Mao was averse to talking to the Americans in order to defeat the Japanese? No, he wasn't. Do you think Ho Chi Minh was averse to talking to the Americans to defeat the French? No, he was not. And then he obviously also had to fight the Americans, right? So this is the thing about politics, is that you look at who you're fighting at that particular point in time, and then you ally yourself with various other people to defeat that opponent. You remember my lecture from the previous class where I spoke about Gramsci and positional war and so on? Not anymore. Like a good LUM student, you've left it out of the... But anyway, that's what I'm talking about, right? That's very, very common in politics. In fact, people who get stuck, tactically speaking, on not making such alliances, etc., often end up isolating themselves and, are defeating themselves in politics. Right, so that's how the Americans also came to ally themselves with religious fundamentalists against communists, or with secular dictators, or with others, etc. It didn't matter what they were, as long as they were helping to fight the people whom they considered to be their main enemy at the time. Ayesha Siddiqua leaves us with three very important questions, which I would like to raise in front of all of you. Well, the first is there an essential link between military institutions, evolution as a class with respect to its economic interests, and the rise of religious extremism? I've given you my opinion. You're free to disagree with that. How does the military business contribute to restructuring social relationships in our society? Does that have a positive or negative net impact? Is it holding back our modernization, development, and so on? Should the rise of religious extremism and xenophobia be seen as one of the costs of military business? Have we become too narrow-minded in our understanding of what Pakistan is as a consequence of the grand master narrative of military business? Right, that brings me to the end of my lecture for today.